Hey everyone, and welcome to our August live event with National Quilter Circle. Once again, we have Colleen back to answer all of your quilting questions. So thanks for being here, Colleen.
Thanks for having me back. This is fun.
Of course. So a few things, if you are new to these live events, you've never tuned in before, what's going to happen is that you can ask Colleen a variety of quilting questions over the next hour, and she will do her best to answer all of them. Enter those questions by typing them into the live chat box, which I believe is orange today. So make sure you're using the correct chat box so it comes to our live stream right now. And then also on the screen where you're watching, you should see a banner that allows you to download one of the free guides we have right now, which is ways to sharpen your tools. So we're going to talk more about that sort of throughout, and I'm going to ask you your preference on sharpening tools a little bit later, Colleen. But just know that you can download that guide. It has some really great tips and different ways that you can sharpen and maintain your tools from your house. So again, ask your questions if you have them. We have one that already came in here. Looking for tips for a t-shirt quilt that does not look so blocky, but more like a scrap quilt.
More like a scrap quilt. Okay. Yeah, this is definitely the time of year everybody is going through and sorting through those t-shirts and wanting to make a keepsake kind of thing, maybe from somebody from high school or even a memory quilt sometimes. The biggest thing with those, I think, is to create some surround. If you, instead of cutting all of the t-shirts the exact same size, maybe pick a border distance from the design, the center of the t-shirt that you want, and create some fun piecing. Piano keys, hourglass blocks, flying geese, half square triangles, anything like that, so that you can create either a border on one side or maybe even two sides. If it's a really small block, you might want to do it all the way around. Give it some pizzazz, something. But when you're creating those blocks, pick a size that you want to get to. Because if you don't, you're going to have a lot of mismatch on trying to get, you're going to have to add sashing later to get the blocks to fit together. So it's going to take a little bit of math. It's those word problems that we didn't like in third grade. We're going to have to go back and figure out the sizing. Remember, you can always add sashing to make blocks. Say you added two sides to a block. You added flying geese, and now it's like 8.25, and you want it to be 10.5. Well, you can always just add a nice quiet fabric sashing on two sides or the opposite two sides to stretch it out. So don't think about that when you put those pieces on that you're done. It's getting extremely windy here. I do have to note that we are taping this in Iowa, has a severe thunderstorm warning. So and a possible tornado in the area. So if I disappear, I'm going to strongly let you, Ashley, pick up for a while. And things are blowing by my window and I can't see too well up there right now. So, I'm from Iowa. I'm sturdy. We're going to keep going as long as.
Okay, so if she just kind of like ducks and runs, that's why. So we'll just kind of,
I didn't think it would get this windy out, but okay. Yeah. Those t-shirt quilts. So making those, having fun with those extra pieces that you can put around the blocks. Think about flying geese, hourglass blocks. Those are the things that are going to add whimsy to the quilt and make it look more like a scrap quilt, more like a fun adventure instead of big blocks of t-shirts throughout the entire thing. And because if you add on different sides of the blocks, then when you join blocks together into rows, you'll get that scrappier effect. And the sashing and things that you put in there will just be the float that goes between your fun t-shirts.
References or additional visual references to go with all of Colleen's amazing hand gestures. We do have a book that is available with a class we have on our website, and that is one that was written by Jen and Mary Canizaro, and they are a mother-daughter duo who do t-shirt quilts, and theirs is called Beyond the Tee, and so they actually make t-shirt quilts and make, the center of a friendship star block is part of that t-shirt, or they make it into a quilt that doesn't look like a t-shirt quilt. So that's kind of a fun one to check out too if you're looking for more visual inspiration on non-blocky t-shirt quilts. All right, our next one here, Constance asks, what about fabric paint? Do you have any suggestions for a good type or brand that is washable?
Fabric paint isn't something that I have a depth of knowledge about, except that I know that when you're working with acrylic paints, you need to add the
I think we might have lost Colleen. I really hope it's not because of a really bad weather issue like she mentioned. It might be. We'll see if she pops back on. I'm hoping she does, but in the meantime, I'm going to talk about the fabric paint because I also have not done a whole lot of work with washable fabric paint. Anytime I've done something with fabric paint, it's because I want a more permanent option. And we have a lot of different classes and short videos, both free and premium, available on National Quilter Circle, where our old instructor Heather Thomas did a lot with inks and paints. So she would use a Sukaniko, if I'm saying that right. It's like TSU. There's a silent T at the beginning, but that's a very prominent brand, one that's easy to find. You can find her videos on that. And then she also has done several where she has mixed up her own dye, and then ones where she has done paint. And actually a really fun one that I will recommend if you're looking for a fun paint on fabric video, again, still done by Heather Thomas, but she shows how to use sort of random things around your house to stencil and mark on your fabric. So she uses, a bunch of stuff that she grabbed from the kitchen drawer and uses all those and shows how to use those as sort of paint prompts or things that you can paint on fabric. So I don't have specific brands for washable paint, and I know that the videos that we have on our website are not necessarily for washable paint, but hopefully that will give you some ideas on ones that if you're looking for a more permanent option for paint, dye, or ink, we definitely have those. Our next question here, I know I'm going to kind of read them to myself and then ask them, but until Colleen pops back on, that's going to kind of be how we go for this. But they are asking about an improv quilting technique that we taught that didn't use rulers. It was a stitch and flip improvisation technique. So I'm not entirely sure I know exactly what video they are referencing. I know we have several different videos on National Quilter Circle for the stitch and flip technique. That's one that's commonly used if you're going to make say a flying geese and you have the one large rectangle and the small squares in the corner. You stitch on your line and then you flip it up. So that's what's known as a stitch and flip. And we have an instructor that has done several other varieties of shapes. So you can do stitch and flip with flying geese, with square and a square, anything where you're starting with two pieces sort of layered together, you're stitching across one and then you flip it up, works as a stitch and flip. So that could be what you're talking about. In terms of it being quilting where we didn't use rulers, another thing that you could be referencing is actually quilt as you go. So stitch and flip quilt as you go is something that you can do. We actually have a couple of videos on National Sewing Circle, which is our sister site, on how to do, we're calling it more of string piecing. And it's a really quick and easy way to make something like a hot pad where you have your backing fabric, you're going to put your batting on top, and then you're just going to lay a strip. So it can be a jelly roll strip. It can be just a scrap piece. You just lay it on there. And then you're going to take your next piece. You're going to put them right sides together and you're going to sew that 1/4 inch away from your fabric pieces, but you're sewing them together through that batting and backing. And then you flip it up, you press, you add your next piece, flip it up, press, and you will eventually add enough scraps or strips that you cover the entire piece of batting and backing. And that is sort of a stitch and flip quilting, quilt as you go. And then when you cover up your entire piece of batting and backing, you can simply square it up, put a binding on it, quick and easy hot pad. Or you can actually make individual blocks that way and then use a similar quilt as you go technique to join all those already quilted blocks together. So I hope one of those two answers was what you were asking in terms of the stitch and flip technique. If not, it definitely gives you some direction as to where to start looking. Our next one, Dorothy wants to know, she says she likes jelly rolls. However, how do you make sure you have a consistent 1/4 inch seam? I even use a 1/4 inch foot. Jelly rolls are tricky. And I'm going to say the main reason that jelly rolls can be tricky, so I happen to have one right here behind me, is depending on the manufacturer. So this is one that's actually from a very common big box store. This came from Joann Fabrics. But if you're getting jelly rolls from big box stores or even from quilt shops, a lot of times they're going to have a pinked edge. So if I get this really close, hopefully you can see that pinked edge right along there. So all that is, if you've ever seen pinking shears, it's just a bunch of little, triangles right across that edge. And it can be very hard to line this up to stitch a 1/4 inch because you either have to line up on the top of the mountain or you have to line up at the bottom of the valley. So you have to kind of decide where you want to line up. And a lot is going to depend on, again, where you got your strip from. So I have a ruler over here on this side. One thing that you can do is jelly roll strips are supposed to be 2.5 inches wide, but sometimes when you get them from non-quilt shop places, they're not always 2.5 inches. Sometimes they are more. Very seldom are they ever less. They're usually more. So if I were to measure mine right here, if I go, it's going to be hard for me to show you here, but if I go from the very outer tip of the mountain to the other very outer tip of the mountain, I'm actually at 2 5/8, not 2.5. So that means for me, if I want to make sure that I am consistent in terms of piecing and getting the finished size that I want, I might either trim this down on one side so that I get 2.5 inches and then I have a straighter side to line up on, or I'm just going to know that mine's going to be a little wider, and I will always try to line up on the outside or the very tip of the mountain, because I think that's easier to see than trying to guess where the valley is. So that would be some tips on how to make sure you are consistent lining up. If you are using your 1/4 inch foot and you're having a huge issue, consider using a 1/4 inch foot with a guide on it. So I don't have my 1/4 inch foot anywhere where I can grab it right now, but some 1/4 inch feet are just a simple 1/4 inch foot and some have a little guide on the edge. So if you can find one that has a guide, then you can more easily line that fabric up along that edge, and you can keep just the tip of the mountains of this pinked edge right along there. So that would be my suggestion for how to make sure you have a consistent 1/4 inch. Also, we just got an update that Colleen has lost all power at her house, so I'm not sure if she'll be able to come back on, if she's got power to a laptop or something, maybe, I'm not sure. So if she pops back on, we'll go with it. If not, still please feel free to ask any quilting questions and I will do my best to answer all of them. And if I can't provide an answer, I can definitely direct you to a video that we probably have on National Quilter Circle that will answer your question. But our next one here, they want to know if you can use flannel as backing and quilt top and quilt. I believe Colleen is back, so I will, as soon as she pops in, it's going to be a little dark, but welcome back.
I'm on a hotspot on my phone because
Perfect.
we don't have power. So everything's running off the battery on my computer and my phone. So we'll see how long I can stay.
Okay, deal. All right. Well, we'll take as long as we can get you here. So our next question, they want to know if you can use flannel as a backing and have a regular quilt top and use flannel as a backing.
Yes. You can most definitely use regular quilter's cotton on one side of your quilt and a flannel on the back. So is it coming through?
Yep. I see you. I think you're a little bit, a lag a little bit, but weather happens.
Yep, it does. And you're kind of like crackly too. So, but a combination of quilters, cottons, flannel, and even a cuddle fabric or a fleece, all of them can be used together at different times. So you can use multiple things as backings for quilts. Be creative. There are a lot of people that do combinations, and I do. I love to put flannel on the back of quilts. I like to put a cuddle fabric or a napped fabric on the back of my quilts. So find something you enjoy, you like the feel of, the warmth of, and use it as part of your quilt.
Yes, absolutely. And pretty much anytime I've ever made a baby quilt, I don't always do my quilting. I've sent it to a very talented friend of mine, and I send her flannel fabric or a fleece fabric for the back. And definitely if I want cuddle fabric for a back, I send that somewhere else too, because I don't want to deal with the cuddle fabric, but also makes another fun backing, so for sure. And next one here, they want to know if you can explain the difference between 100% cotton and quilting cotton, or if there is a difference.
It's cutting out so much, I didn't catch all of it.
Oh, I don't know if we've lost her again.
I can't tell. I can't hear exactly. It's cutting in and out, so I'm getting only a portion of the question. Sorry.
That's okay. I will repeat it, and we'll see if you can get it this time. I'll even talk a little bit slower. I know I talk super fast, but they want to know if there's a difference between 100% cotton and quilting cotton.
I can't pick up enough of it. Sorry. I'm going to have to go back out and come back in. Sorry.
Bye. Okay, well, we are still trying to figure out if she can come back in. I'll go ahead and answer that one. So really, there isn't a whole lot of difference between 100% cotton and quilting cotton. Quilting cotton is generally 100% cotton. That's what they call, I'm going to say like quilters grade cotton. One way that you can, I hate to just always be using this as my example, but usually on your fabric, whether it is on the little tag. So here's this little tag here. I don't know if you can read it or not, but it does say 100% cotton. If you're buying fabric off the bolt, it will generally tell you if it's 100% cotton. Fat quarters, things like that are generally 100% cotton. So I'm going to say in general, quilting cotton is 100% cotton. However, they do make cottons that are not 100%, and you can find those, but think of those as more like your garment cottons, things where it's like a shirting fabric or something where you want a little bit of, polyester blend in with your cotton so you can have a little bit of stretch. So if you are at a quilt shop, most likely everything they have there is 100% cotton. Even if you're at a big box store, their quilting section or all of the quilting prints and the solids and things like that will usually be 100% cotton as well. So there's not a whole lot of difference, I'm going to say, between the two. I consider 100% cotton and quilting cotton interchangeably and one and the same, but just know that not all cotton is 100% cotton, depending on maybe the area of the store that you've purchased it from. Our next question here, I want to make a memory quilt with my mom's memorable pieces, but they're not all cotton. Any suggestions? So you absolutely can make a quilt out of any and every fabric that's out there. We actually have a couple great videos for reference that if you want to go see some visuals. Again, this was a video done by Heather Thomas, but she talks about all the different types of of fabrics that you can use in a quilt and how you can combine them. The big thing is you want to make sure that everything, I'm going to step back. If you're going to make a quilt that you want to use and that you're going to need to wash, you need to make sure that all of those pieces, whether they're cotton or not, are washable. So you can't really have, half of your quilt is quilter's cotton or fabric that has been pre-washed and you're good with, but then you have these pieces of, say, velvet or velour or denim or whatever it's going to be that doesn't mix in well. So make sure if you're going to wash it, that everything has already been pre-washed, pre-shrunk, pre-treated. If you're not planning on washing it at all, it's just going to be, memory one, you're going to hang it on the wall, you're going to keep it somewhere for sentimental reasons. Don't necessarily worry about that step. But any fabric that is woven, so that is a very large amount of fabrics, you should be able to piece all those together, really no problem. You can piece, like I mentioned, a denim with a flannel, with cotton fabric. The bulkier your fabric gets, you may have better luck using a little bit thicker of a seam allowance. So if you're, normally doing your scant 1/4 inch or your accurate 1/4 inch when it comes to piecing just your quilting cotton, if you're using a thicker fabric or anytime I'm, say, piecing a quilt top that's going to be entirely out of fleece or flannel, I'll use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. But still, you should be able to piece it just fine. If any of the fabric that you're adding in has any stretch to it, so whether that's a t-shirt fabric, just a fun knit fabric, something that you thought was a woven but definitely has a little bit of stretch to it, I would recommend adding some stabilizer. So there's so many different types and brands out there. If you are using t-shirts, there's something you can buy specifically called Stability, and it is sort of some pre-cut squares. You can also buy it on the bolt if you're going to make a big project, but pre-cut squares that work really great for stabilizing, motifs or areas of a t-shirt. There's also something, and I haven't got to play around with it a whole lot yet. I just got a bottle of it, but it's called TYRI Magic, and it is a liquid, almost, I'm not going to call it a spray starch. It's sort of a little more complex than that in that you spray it on your fabric. It makes it into something that is a lot stiffer, easier to work with. You can even, print images on it or print something on it if you needed to, and then it does just wash right out. So if it's any kind of knit or stretch, definitely stabilize it a little bit before you put it in with everything else. But other than that, if it's all woven fabrics or once they've been stabilized and act like a woven fabric, piece everything together, just increase that seam allowance if you find you're having issues with those bulkier fabrics, and then you should be good to go with your memory quilt. All right, next one here. Marilyn says, hello from Florida. She says her cousin passed away recently, and her son sent a quilt top that she'd made asking if I'd finish it. It arrived recently, but I see that it is hand pieced and has a few gaps in the seams. I've only machine pieced, and I'm wondering if a hand pieced quilt can be machine quilted. I'm going to say absolutely. And I also think that before you machine quilt it, some of those seams that you say where there are some gaps, I would go ahead and reinforce those with some machine quilting. So unless this person has specifically asked you to hand quilt it because it was hand pieced, maybe double check with them to see what they're wanting. But no, I would absolutely machine quilt a hand pieced quilt. So right now I'm actually working on an English paper pieced quilt, which is all done by hand. And I'm, tying knots and being as consistent and careful as I can with my stitches, but I know it's still hand pieced. So I'm going to feel a lot better with that quilt when it's done if I know that it's machine quilted, because it's really going to help make sure all of our layers and all of our pieces stay together a little better. So yes, I would definitely machine quilt a hand pieced quilt. All right, a new one here. Eric says he's a new quilter here, and my quilts so far have turned out wrinkly after I quilt them. I usually stitch in the ditch and then do an X across the individual squares. I safety pin base and start from the center, press everything very well. Any ideas what I'm doing wrong? So without seeing it, and it sounds like you're doing everything right by pin basing, starting in the center, if things are still getting wrinkly, I want to make sure that you mean it's wrinkly immediately after you quilt it and not after you've washed it, because of course after you wash it, if you've used cotton or cotton poly batting, that will shrink a little bit and it does wrinkle it, and that's sort of an effect that some people like with that batting specifically, is it gives it sort of this wrinkled, I want to say used look, but comfy look, and so that kind of comes along or goes along with that batting. I would say if it's wrinkling sort of in the areas where you're stitching, maybe you're not basting close enough together. So some people say you can put your fist on your quilt and you should touch a safety pin, in all areas on your fist. But, I don't know. Everyone's hands are different sizes. If I had my husband put his hand on the quilt, obviously his pins could be further spaced out than mine. So I'm going to say you really want to be pinning every couple inches. So if you're not putting in that many safety pins, then definitely put in a few more and make sure that everything is nice and secure before you start. Also, in terms of how you're putting together your quilt sandwich. So I know a lot of people will lay out their quilt back on the floor first and tape it to the floor so it's nice and taut. If you don't have a big enough floor space or a hardwood floor where you could tape it to, we have a great video, again, that Heather Thomas did for us, and she shows how to baste a large quilt on a table using some clamps. So you can actually clamp the fabric, the backing fabric, to the table, and then put out your batting and your quilt top and make sure that you have, I don't want to say stretched the backing because you really don't want to stretch it, but you want to make sure that everything is as taut as possible before you start quilting, because if you're starting with already sort of wrinkled or pushed together pieces, you're not going to be able to spread it out like you want to. So definitely check that out if you don't have the space to be able to lay out the whole quilt. But yeah, I would recommend making sure that everything is sort of pulled taut first, add in more of those pins, and then if you are doing your stitch in the ditch and then an X across, I don't know if you are using your I'm going to assume maybe not free motion since you're doing straight lines. So if that's the case, put a walking foot on your machine. So the walking foot's going to help feed all of those layers a little bit better. With free motion quilting, you're using a darning or a hopping foot, and there's not as much pressure on all of the quilt layers. So if you're not free motion quilting and you're doing just straight line quilting with a standard presser foot, if you can't lessen that presser foot pressure, then use a walking foot, a roller foot. If you have a FOF machine that you can activate that integrated dual feed, do that. Anything so you're not squishing the layers as much, because that could actually be an issue when you're trying to quilt, is that things aren't feeding evenly, and so the wrinkling is happening maybe on the top because the feed dogs are pulling the bottom good, but the presser foot is putting too much tension on the top. So that could be an issue as well. So I know that's kind of lots of things to try out, but hopefully a combination of all those things will help fix those issues so that nothing turns out wrinkly. Oh, one last thing I'll say too, even with the walking foot, if you're doing just straight quilting using your feed dogs and all that, just increase your stitch length just a little bit. If you normally piece on a 2, definitely increase it to, I would say, like a 3, 2.5 to a 3. That way again, because you have so many extra layers and you're still using your feed dogs and your presser foot, that 3 is going to look more like a 2.5. So yeah, if you've kept it on your piecing stitch length of 2, definitely increase that stitch length a little bit, and that should also help. All right, Mary wants to know, looking at buying a new machine and could use some help with that. What machine has the ability to give the 1/4 inch seam allowance, good markings on throat plate, and any other assist? Because of COVID, you're having to buy a machine without actually seeing it and trying it. Yes, that's kind of tricky, definitely, since I think the number one thing that we say is go test drive your machine, and that's just really not an option right now a lot of places. So in terms of machines that have the ability to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, pretty much every single machine has that ability. If you want one that comes specifically with a 1/4 inch foot or 1/4 inch markings on the throat plate, then I'm going to say make sure you find, it doesn't matter what brand. I'm not a brand specific. I have multiple brands of machines in my sewing room at all times. So not necessarily brand specific, but within whatever brand you pick a model that says it is sewing and quilting. So one that is, you can find machines that say sewing only, or you find machines that say sewing quilting, which means they generally come with that 1/4 inch foot. They'll come with a walking foot. They'll come with free motion capability, meaning you can raise and lower those feed dogs. It'll come with a hopping foot or a darning foot. It'll come with things like applique stitches, stuff that's standard to quilting. And so a machine that's labeled sewing and quilting, you're going to have better luck with in getting that 1/4 inch seam allowance. In terms of markings on the throat plate, lots of machines don't start at a 1/4 inch in terms of the throat plate. Because if you think about where your throat plate is, the opening for your bobbin case, by the time you get to your throat plate, you are already more than, say, a 1/4 inch away from your needle. So that marking isn't really helpful on lots of machines in those throat plates. So again, I wish I had it right next to me. It's not one of the machines that's behind me because those are kind of ancient. But on some machines, and this is something that even if your machine doesn't come with it, I would try and find one that fits your machine and get it. But rather than having that 1/4 inch marking on your throat plate, on the metal throat plate, that 1/4 inch marking is on the plastic bobbin cover. So it's a solid line that gives you, 2 inches or 1.5 inches or however big your bobbin cover is. It gives you that much of sort of a runway of that 1/4 inch mark to get you up to the needle. So you don't have to wait until you're already at your needle where your throat plate marking might be to get that 1/4 inch. So I would say any brand of machine, pick a model that says quilting. If you can get one that has that marking already on that bobbin cover, get it. If not, I would say try and find one that fits your machine. Or in terms of 1/4 inch seam allowances, I'm a huge fan of the 1/4 inch foot. I use it all the time. I know some of our other instructors don't like the 1/4 inch foot as much. They like to use something like a moleskin or a mole foam or some other kind of thick tape, and they put that on their machine bed and then put a ruler next to it and then move the needle position until you get exactly 1/4 inch away. So really any machine has the ability to do 1/4 inch foot, but a machine that's labeled as for quilting will have some of those sort of extra things that you may want as well. So that's what I would recommend. And also, I think lots of machine companies and places now know that people are having to buy machines without being able to test drive it. So if you are at all worried about it, make sure you're looking at a company or looking at a place that has some kind of money back guarantee. I mean, I don't know that I've ever sat down, or a return policy at least, within a certain amount of time. So I'm not sure that I've sat down in a machine and absolutely hated it. There's definitely been features I've liked of one machine over another. So you might find that. But yeah, if you're at all worried about it, just make sure that it's a company that has some sort of return for at least, 30, 60 days or something like that. All right. And next one, tips on making a pet quilt using denim. So that's a good idea. So I'm not normally I don't usually like denim fabric, but I love the idea of it for a pet because obviously it's going to hold up a lot better than just your standard fabric. So really, denim is very easy fabric to cut with. It's very easy to mark on, very easy to cut. In terms of sewing, because it is thicker, you definitely want to be using a denim or a jeans needle, slightly heavier thread also because you have such a heavier fabric. I would recommend doing that. I still think you could probably use a 1/4 inch seam allowance when you're piecing denim, but if that's just not giving you enough to be able to press it, to press those seams open, maybe increase that to 3/8 of an inch. But really, you shouldn't have any other issues when it comes to denim that you would with a quilting cotton. Just know that it's going to be heavier. Use that heavier needle, heavier thread, and same thing when you're quilting it. So obviously it's going to be that heavier fabric. I don't know if you plan on doing the backing also out of denim, so this thing is 100% denim, but then you really, really want to make sure that you're using that heavier needle, that denim needle, if you're going to be having a denim quilt top and a denim backing with some batting in between, or I think you're going to find you're going to break a few needles. So that would be my biggest tip, would be the right needles and the right thread. And other than that, you should be able to piece like normal, really. Next one here, what thread is best for piecing? So you've been using cotton and silk finish, which is very linty. Yes, not only linty, but anything that has like silk built in, it just ups the price. So I always go with either 100% cotton thread or a cotton polyester blend, which is known as an all-purpose thread, just because I do a lot of garment sewing as well, and so I just always have it on hand. So when it comes to my piecing, sometimes I'm more worried about grabbing the right, color or neutral color of thread versus whether it's 100% cotton or if it's cotton poly. But I always say, if you're any kind of sewing, so quilting, garment sewing, you want to match your thread content to your fiber content. So if I'm using 100% quilting cotton, I'm going to use 100% cotton thread. Cotton thread does still have some lint involved, and I know depends on who you talk to out there. People have their brand preferences, and some say, oh, I avoid this brand because I think that brand is too linty, or this brand is too linty. So still within cotton thread, you're going to have some lint, and I think you might find that some threads are lintier than others, but I still stand behind using 100% cotton thread. If you find that there's a certain thread you're using, and just as you're sewing, you can just see like little bits of lint coming off that thread, with that thread specifically, I'm going to say use a larger needle, or one specifically that has a little bit of a larger eye. So this could be a bit unconventional, but a needle like a metallic needle or a top stitch needle has a larger eye, and that larger eye is going to make it so that your thread is not getting shredded as much as it's being pulled through the eye of that needle. So while I would normally say piece with a universal or all-purpose needle, if you have that thread that you just can't get there not to be a bunch of lint coming off of it, try piecing with a needle that has a slightly bigger eye and just see if that works, and then maybe switch to a different brand of thread after that and see if that sort of helps with your lint option. But yes, I would go with 100% cotton thread or cotton poly blend, which is all purpose. Have I ever used silk in a quilt before? I have not. So I like cotton fabric. I know you can do any kind of fabric you want, and I know whether it's for a memory quilt, a crazy quilt, like you can definitely use any kind of fabric that you want. I just like silk and satins, and those kind of fabrics are not my favorite to work with. They ravel a lot. I can't use my steam because I'm afraid if I drip water on it that I'm going to get that permanent water drop on that silk or satin fabric. So I personally have never used silk in a quilt. I know you can. You most definitely can. And you really should be able to treat it just like if you are piecing with cotton. You should be able to cut your pieces just fine. Still use that 1/4 inch seam allowance, but just know that it is going to ravel a lot compared to your regular quilter's cotton. So either be prepared for that and know that you don't want to do a whole lot of sort of fiddling with your quilt, like piece it, trim off those stray threads, and then quilt it right away. So otherwise you're going to have all these pieces coming off. Also, my other pet peeve with silk and satin fabrics is it's so staticky. So treating that fabric, I'm not usually a proponent of something like a best press or a starch or in any way pre-treatment of a fabric. But because silk has some of those attributes, and I find like as you cut it, sometimes you just have like those threads that just sort of stick to you and stick to everything else. I would use either some sort of spray starch or you can find it in the laundry aisle, and it's a blue can with an orange lid, and it's meant for like de-staticking things, normally clothing, but it works really well on fabric too. So I would use that sort of to pre-treat or sort of prep silk a little bit if you just have to use it in that project. Our next one here, Vanessa says, NQC has a video on making a dimensional pinwheel block. Do you have some good quilt patterns that will include this block? So that is a good video. I actually did that video. That's a fun one and a fun block to make. And we don't actually have a quilt pattern that goes along with that block, but I would say with that block, when I was making it, in my mind, I was using it more as one that I wouldn't put in a full like quilt that I'm going to use on my bed, because there's so many layers, because it is so dimensional, that it's very, very heavy. And if you're going to put it on a bed and someone's going to be using this quilt, sitting on this quilt, those pinwheels aren't going to stay as dimensional as you may want them to the more it gets used. So I would actually say make, depending on the size, the finished size of the block, maybe make 4 of them or 9 of them, a 3x3, and make it into a pillow. Or the other thought I had when I was making these dimensional quilt blocks was, at the time, I have another baby now, but I had my 3-year-old was a baby then, and I was thinking more along the lines of dimensional things that you want kids to play with. So it would be a really fun block on a baby quilt too, because it's something where they can actually play with the parts on the actual pinwheel. So while I maybe personally wouldn't want it on my, say, big bed quilt, that isn't to say that you wouldn't want it on yours. So again, if I was going to do it, just coming up with quilt patterns off the top of my head real quick, in terms of if you are wanting to use this 3-dimensional pinwheel block on a quilt pattern for a bed quilt, I would use it in essentially the border area only. So the area that's going to be draped off of the bed. That way it still looks really nice, it still stays dimensional, doesn't have gravity working against it because it's laying flat on top of the bed. It's sort of out, on the sides or the bottom, and then no one's going to sit on it. So that's where I would incorporate that block into a bed quilt if you didn't want to do sort of the pillow route or the fun textile kind of baby quilt. The name of the liquid I mentioned that can be put on fabric to make it stiffer so that you can print on it, it's called TYRI Magic, and it's like TERIAL, almost like material, TYRI Magic, and it just comes in a little bottle, and you can either put a little spray top on it. Comes with instructions on how to use it. So I actually found out about it from Jen and Mary Canizaro, the ones I talked about earlier, who do the t-shirt quilts, and they have used that to help stabilize some of their fabrics in terms of t-shirts, and also so they can print on it. And they're the ones that sent me the bottle, and I just haven't had a spare moment to be able to play around with it yet. So I can't give you a full review on it, but I know they love it. Comes very highly recommended from them, and I have it, and I will try it out hopefully soon, and then be able to give you more information on how it works. But they make it sound pretty awesome, and I believe them. So yeah, TYRI Magic. What does a stitch regulator do? So a stitch regulator a lot of times comes on machines that are used for free motion quilting. So they can be found on as a standalone attachment that can be plugged into a machine. I've only ever seen it on a Bernina. I haven't got to try it out yet, but I know it exists. But a stitch regulator will be a feature on a machine that's meant for long arm quilting. So the machine that's actually on, the big frame that you're going to use to long arm. And what it does is it regulates the stitch length. So the speed at which you move is you will always get a consistent stitch length. So if you're going very slow, it will regulate it so it continues to give you a 2 or 2.5 or whatever you set your stitch length to be. But then if you are a pro at quilting and you're just a speed demon and going all over, you're not going to end up with really, really long stitches because you're going too fast. So the stitch regulator will make all of your stitches stay consistent no matter what speed you're quilting at. So for some, I don't do pretty much any long arm quilting. I send mine out to be quilted. But as somebody who doesn't do a lot of long arm quilting, that's very intimidating to me. So I think a stitch regulator would help me. But I have done interviews with some people on our podcast. So if you haven't listened to our podcast on the website, you should do that. But they are professional long armers, and they don't like the stitch regulator because they like to be in total control of everything that has to do with their stitches and their quilting. So try it out if you have the ability to. Some people love it, some people hate it. I think it sounds pretty cool and something that would help me get into long arm quilting and feel a little bit more comfortable with it. But I know it's sort of one of those features that everyone sort of has their opinion on. They either like it or they don't. But that's what it does, is it keeps your stitches even and consistent. All right, so can feet from one machine be used on another? I have a Brother SE400 and a Jazz 2. Can I use the Brother walking foot on the Jazz? I think the Jazz is a model, and it might be a Janome. I'm not sure exactly which one that is, but it depends on the machines and the brands and the feet. So sometimes feet are interchangeable. So I have purchased a sort of an accessory pack that's a bunch of different feet, and it says fits, and it will list 3 or 4 different types of machines that it fits. I don't know off the top of my head what exact machine is interchangeable with another. So try it out carefully. And by that, I mean, the other day I put a foot on my machine, on my Viking machine that I thought was going to work. And I used the hand wheel to test it out first. And I brought that hand wheel down and the needle hit the very back of the foot. So that foot does not fit that machine. So try it out first, slowly, carefully. Or just if you can consult if your foot came with any information as to say what it might be compatible with, check there. Or like I said, I'm not entirely sure I know what brand the Jazz is. So maybe just do a quick Google search. Are Brother and X machine feet interchangeable? And see what information you can find there. But in all, I said, if I had access to both machines and I have the foot sitting in front of me, I'm just going to try it out and see. But like I said, use that hand wheel to test it out first. So you make sure your needle's not going to hit that foot at all. You don't want to damage the machine, break the foot, break the needle, anything like that. So just test it out slowly first. Sandy asks, if you do a quilt as you go approach, how are the blocks joined together? All right, I'm going to do my best to tell you how to do that with no actual blocks in front of me, and I hope this makes sense, but if not, we do have videos on National Quilter Circle that you can follow up with for better visuals and see. So essentially what you're going to do is there's 2 main ways that you can do quilt as you go and join quilt as you go blocks. First way is that you can essentially do it with, I'm going to call them fake sashing strips. So picture you have 2 blocks and you're going to put them together. They're already quilted, they're already trimmed up, they're squared, they're perfect. You go ahead and you just abut those 2 edges. So you have the batting, the backing, everything is all trimmed up nice and even. You lay those right next to each other, and then you have cut a sashing strip. Whatever width you want your sashing strip to be, let's just pretend that this is our sashing strip here. It's 2.5 inches. I'm going to fold under along the edges and press, and so I have a nice finished edge, and then I'm going to put that over the top of my just abutted edges. So when I say abut, I mean I don't want to overlap them at all because I don't want any extra thickness anywhere in those seams. You just want to put them right next to each other. Then you're going to put this faux sashing strip down on top, and then you can stitch it on any way you want. You can either stitch really, really close to that folded edge. You can applique it in place using a blanket stitch or a zigzag stitch, and you're essentially attaching that strip to the top of both these blocks, and you're going to do it on the top and on the back so it hides the seam in both places, and that is going to keep it together. So that's one way that you can do it. When you abut those edges, you can either just keep them next to each other, go ahead and pin your strip in place and stitch it. If you're having any issues, if you're using really, really big blocks, like you have 16 or 20 inch blocks that you're putting together, and you're having an issue with those blocks shifting or moving at all, you can go ahead and just put them together and then zigzag stitch, kind of like a basting stitch, but zigzag to hold them together, and then again cover up that seam with that, I'm gonna call it a faux sashing strip. The other way you can do it is when you are quilting your quilt as you go block. So again, we'll say we have a 16-inch block that we have finished quilting. Normally when you're quilting something, you're quilting completely off the edge. You're totally quilting the entire quilt, the entire block, everything, and you're going right off the edge. In this case, for this technique, don't quilt all the way to the edge. Quilt to within about 3/8 to 1/2 inch of the edge. You want to give yourself some extra fabric on the quilt top, the top of the fabric that hasn't been quilted. So you can then take your 2 blocks that have been quilted, put them together, right sides together, and you are going to stitch just that quilt top fabric together. So you're going to have sort of some, batting and some backing fabric that you're going to have to sort of pull out of the way, pin it back, clip it back, whatever you have to do to keep it out of the way so you can stitch the quilt top together. Once you have the top together, go ahead and lay it down flat on your surface with the top down. Trim the layers of batting until they are perfectly right next to one another. Again, no overlaps anywhere. Once they're trimmed, then you're going to pick whichever side of the backing fabric you want. I'm right-handed, so it's always the right side for me. I'm going to press under about 1/4 inch and fold under and press. Then you're going to overlap. So you have your quilt top that is completely stitched together. You have your batting that you have trimmed so it's laying nice and flat. Now on your backing fabric, you're going to have one side that lays down, one side that has been folded and pressed under so it's a finished edge, and you're going to lay that one on top. And then you have a nice finished edge, and you will hand stitch or invisible stitch that folded edge down just as if you were attaching a binding. So you're never going to see it. It's going to look like a seam on the back. It's going to be a perfect seam on the front because you did it by machine, and your batting is going to be nice and even. So if I had to pick between my two, I like the second option in terms of being able to get it done quicker, but if you were already going to add sashing strips to your quilt anyway, the first method where you kind of have this faux sashing strip is another good, quick and easy way to do it. So I hope that makes sense with my sort of hand gestures and diagrams. Again, we have videos on National Quilter Circles that has additional visuals or more step-by-steps, and hopefully that will give you some more direction as well. All right, our next one here, Diane wants to know, what is my favorite spray adhesive? You've tried the homemade version found online with little to no success. So I have to say that I am not a spray adhesive person. However, if you've watched live events we've done in the past with Andrea Smith of Happy Cloud Creations, or you've seen some of the lives we've done on Facebook because she's been a host of our challenge, she uses spray-based a lot. So she has talked about some brands that she has liked. I know there was one that she was using previously, and then she switched from them because she didn't like it was either the new formula, they changed their formula, something about it, I'm not sure. But during one of our last challenges with her, we were actually working with Sulky, and so Sulky sent us some of their spray base to use, and so she did use that and try it out and did like using it. So Sulky has a really good spray based or spray adhesive. That is really the only one I've ever really used because I'm not somebody who uses a lot of spray adhesive. So I don't know that I have a favorite. I'm going to give you that one as a recommendation to go try first and see if you like it. And maybe if other people on here have tried out some spray based and maybe they have some suggestions, please feel free to share those so you can kind of get, a list of here's ones to try, here's what you like, what you don't like, and you can go from there. So I would recommend the Sulky one as a first try and then go from there. All right, Julie wants to know, where do you find your inspiration to design an original one-of-a-kind quilt? So I design pretty much all the quilts that I make and write patterns for are ones that I have designed. And a lot of times it can just depend on the fabric that I'm using or something that I saw. So like this quilt behind me right here. So this one is one that I designed after being on Pinterest and Instagram around last Christmas when every single person I knew had something plaid or were wearing plaid pajamas or just had something sort of that rustic theme going on. And so that kind of gave me inspiration for that quilt design. So it'll either come from something I see scrolling through social media. Sometimes it'll come from a certain fabric you'll get inspiration for because you want to highlight a motif, or maybe the fabric design has some floral notes, so you want to make blocks that somehow look like flowers. So really it's kind of a hard question to nail down because it changes pretty much with any quilt that I've made. It kind of has a different something different spurred the inspiration for that design. So I think it's kind of different for every quilt and different for every person. So I think just the next time you are, say, scrolling through social media, scrolling through Pinterest, looking at fabric, just try to visualize or find something that you like within a fabric, whether that is a certain design, a certain motif, and then try and use that as your main inspiration and see what you can kind of drum up in terms of quilt designs from there. Next question, what is lawn and can it be used for quilting? So lawn is a fabric that I more readily associate with garments. And off the top of my head, I cannot tell you exactly what the fiber content of it is. I know it's more of a lightweight drapey kind of fabric. So while I know we've talked about this a lot sort of over the past hour, you can use any fabric you want in a quilt. Just know that it may not react the same as a quilting cotton. So again, because I can't remember the fiber content off the top of my head, I can't tell you if it's going to shrink, if it can be laundered, all of that. So if you're going to use it all on its own, still make sure that you have sort of washed it, pre-shrunk it, made sure that it's going to stand up to a quilt, and then yeah, go ahead and give it a try. Like I said, any fabric can be used to make a quilt, but when I think of lawn and cotton lawn, I think of garments, not necessarily quilts. So definitely do a little bit more research on that fabric, but I'm going to say maybe don't make a quilt out of it, make a skirt or something instead, unless you really want to use that and like I said, or a crazy quilt or something like that. But that would be my initial thoughts on cotton or cotton lawn. All right. Mary says, what machines can take a bit of abuse, i.e. running over a pin? My old machine Viking would go out of whack after only running over one pin accidentally. So, well, I'm not here to say that you should be running over pins while you are sewing and quilting. Please try to remove them first. I will say, okay, so this machine back here behind me, this is a Singer. This was my grandma's, and this is one that I don't even know how many pins it has probably hit, and it still works. So this is, like I said, I'm not saying go find an old machine and run over as many pins as you want, but I am saying that the older, more mechanical-based machines or a heavy-duty machine is going to better resist accidents like that. I did have a Viking, similarly, not the one I'm using now, but an older one where even if I was trying to go through maybe layers of super thick fabric, not even just hitting a pin, if I didn't have the right needle in it or my needle was getting dull and it just didn't have the power to be able to go through, it would just stop and I would literally get an error message that says your machine is taking a break, or it's something along those lines where you have to like turn off the machine, turn it back on. So I'm going to say if you're not someone who is really, really careful and takes those pins out, or you know that you maybe are going to run over a pin, I'm going to recommend maybe not something super computerized, a heavy-duty machine, almost a more industrial type machine than sort of a fancier computerized machine. But please try to take your pins out before you stitch over them so you just don't have to worry about that at all. Our next one, Chris wants to know, what needle should I use for satin stitching on applique? So needle doesn't necessarily matter in terms of what stitch you're doing. So I don't usually do a satin stitch. I usually do a blanket stitch in terms of applique, but the stitch doesn't matter as much as the thread and fabric you're using. So if you're appliquing cotton on cotton, I'm going to use a medium weight all-purpose universal needle. So don't necessarily match the needle to any kind of stitch you're doing. Match your needle to whatever thread and fabric you're using. So again, yeah, for a simple satin stitch, zigzag stitch, blanket stitch, anything in terms of applique, I would use just a universal needle. All right, our next one here, pressing seems super important, particularly to keep things flat on the back of the block. Some patterns tell you to press, some don't. Any guidelines? Yes. So as someone who has written a fair amount of patterns also, sometimes if it's a more complex pattern, I provide pressing instructions. And on some of them, if it's just a super quick, easy, free pattern download, I don't always provide pressing directions. So if the pattern tells you pressing directions, definitely follow those pressing directions. That means they are telling you to press those seams in a certain direction for a specific reason, whether that is to make sure things lay flatter on the back, or that is to help seams nest later during the construction process. That's usually why designers will provide that pressing instruction. If there's no pressing directions provided at all, one rule of thumb is to always press towards the darker of the two fabrics. So if you're pressing, this is going to be a very generic example, but I have white fabric and I have black fabric and I've sewn them together. You're going to press those seams towards the black fabric because they're not going to show through as much as they would with the white fabric. So that is one way to sort of give yourself a good ballpark generalization. Press towards the darker fabric. Or say you're making a simple quilt and it's just, we're going to say it's a 3x3 layout. You have 3 blocks in 3 rows, and you are wanting to know which way to press so that things will nest. So one row, I'm going to press all those seams to the right. The next row, I'm going to press all the seams to the left. That way, when I go to put those blocks together, they will nest. So that's sort of some basic guidelines. Press towards the darker, press so that your seams will nest. But generally, on a more complex pattern where there is the need for things to fit together, or there's lots of units that make up one block, those types of patterns will generally provide some sort of pressing instruction or pressing guideline. So I do want to mention again that I know I mentioned at the very beginning and then I kind of forgot to in the middle, but we do have again that guide for you to download. So I wasn't able to ask Colleen any of her favorite ways to sharpen or maintain her tools, and I hope she's still safely watching us somewhere just without power, and hopefully the weather's not too bad there. But again, there is a guide for 6 ways to sharpen your tools at home. So this is a great way to sharpen and maintain several different tools. So specifically, people ask a lot about sharpening rotary cutters and scissors, snips, things that you use all the time and things that dull very quickly and that can kind of get costly if you're having to replace them all the time. So it is a guide on how to do that using some fun, easy household items. So I'm going to tell you what one of the items is, but then I want you to go download the guide so you can see what all of the rest of the items are. But the main one that I know a lot of people use is tin foil or aluminum foil. So the guide tells you how to very easily use several layers of foil to sharpen your rotary blades, sharpen your scissors, sharpen your snips, keep them in good working order. The guide also has several other tools or items that you can use to sharpen things, and also other items that can be sharpened, like how to keep your seam rippers sharp, how to keep pins and needles sharp if you have little nicks in those. So definitely a good guide full of lots of information. Again, that should be on your screen somewhere. You can click that banner to download 6 ways to sharpen your tools and keep them in good working order for longer, so you're not having to replace things so often. So I hope you guys enjoyed this live event. I apologize, it was just me and we lost Colleen early on. Again, she will probably be back here with us later on or next month or next time when there's not really bad weather, but we will get her back to answer more of your quilting questions, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.